I caught my husband with the bride, but my son said, "Don't stop them yet." I woke up with the dry taste of pills on my tongue and the ache in my hips that comes from being 72 years old and sleeping on a mattress that has seen too many seasons. The clock on my nightstand glowed 2:14 a.m. I reached for my glass of water and knocked it over. The sound of it hitting the floor made me flinch. My mouth was dry, my heart unsteady. I slipped my feet into my slippers and wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, telling myself I only needed to fetch another glass of water from the kitchen. The hallway was dark, the way it always was at night, only a thin slice of moonlight coming through the window above the stairs. For a moment I thought I heard laughter, soft and syrupy, but told myself it must be the television Walter sometimes left on. I padded down the stairs, one hand on the rail. When I reached the bottom, I saw a glow spilling from the kitchen. I moved closer, slow and silent, because old habits from teaching children make you quiet when you approach a noise you cannot name. And then I saw them. Layla stood in the kitchen barefoot, her hair loose, wearing one of those satin robes she brought when she moved into my house as my son's fiancée. But she was not with Dustin. She was pressed up against Walter, my husband of 50 years, her arms looped around his neck. She tilted her head back, eyes half closed, and whispered, "Daddy," in a tone so intimate and hungry it made my stomach turn. Walter's hand was on her lower back, his fingers tracing slow circles as if she were something precious. I stopped breathing. My knees locked. I thought for a moment I might faint right there on the tile. The shawl slipped from my shoulders, but I could not move to catch it. Layla's voice drifted again, this time a murmur of promises, and Walter's mouth bent toward hers. I saw his face in the light of the refrigerator, slack and adoring, like a boy caught in a fever dream. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was betrayal with both hands open. I stepped forward, not thinking, my fingers curling into fists, ready to shout his name. But a shadow moved beside me, and a hand closed gently but firmly around my arm. I turned and saw my son standing there in the darkness of the hall. Dustin's face was pale, but his eyes were sharp, colder than I had ever seen them. He shook his head once, a small motion, like a teacher signaling a student to wait. "Mother," he whispered, leaning close so only I could hear. "I know, I have known for weeks. But do not stop them yet. Please, not yet." His breath was steady, his grip sure, and the words fell into my chest like stones. I wanted to scream, to tear the kitchen apart, to drag Walter away from her, but my son's eyes held me in place. They were not the eyes of a man in shock. They were the eyes of a man building something. My mouth opened, but no sound came. Layla giggled softly, the sound of it making my skin crawl. Walter muttered something low and eager. I felt my world tilting, everything I had done for them sliding like loose earth under my feet. The boy I had nursed through fevers, the man I had sat up with after surgeries, was telling me not to act. At that moment, I thought I might break. My vision blurred. I clutched the banister with my free hand and whispered back, "Dustin, how can you are?" But he squeezed my arm gently. "I need you to trust me, Mother," he said, voice low and deliberate. "I have a plan. They will fall into it themselves. You must let this happen." "I installed the camera weeks ago, Mother," Dustin said quietly. "I've been watching their walks. This isn't new. I just needed you to see it too. I may be old, but I still see every move. I may be quiet, but I hold every secret, and one day I will unleash the truth louder than any lie." My heart was a drumbeat of betrayal and disbelief. My husband was in my kitchen with my son's fiancée. My heart was a drumbeat of betrayal and disbelief. My husband was in my kitchen with my son's fiancée. My son was telling me to stand still. I felt the air grow thin around me, as if the house itself were holding its breath. It would have been easy to collapse, to run, to pretend I had not seen. But his eyes were steady, and something in them told me he was not abandoning me. He was waiting for the exact right moment. He was waiting for the trap to close. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening." I stayed there in the shadows, my shawl at my feet, my son's hand still on my arm. Layla shifted, pressed her cheek to Walter's chest, and murmured another "Daddy" that scraped down my spine like a claw. Walter stroked her hair. "Soon," he said, his voice thick. "Soon you'll have everything." I felt my lips tremble but forced them still. I had survived childbirth, long nights of grading papers, and watching neighbors' children grow up while my own husband drifted. I could survive this moment too. Dustin's plan flickered behind his eyes, a glint of steel in the dark. "Go back to bed, Mother," he whispered. "Please, we are almost there." I nodded once, though every nerve in my body screamed to tear them apart. I turned slowly, my slippers whispering against the floor, and walked back up the stairs. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the railing with both. Behind me, the low murmur of Layla and Walter continued, a vile duet I would never forget. In my room I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the wood. I felt the old ache in my hips, the taste of salt in my mouth, and a new, cold clarity settling in my chest. My son had a plan. My husband had betrayed me. And the woman who called me mother at dinner had just called my husband daddy in the dark. I sat down on the edge of the bed, hands in my lap, and stared at the pill bottle on my nightstand. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator below. For the first time in years, I felt not just wounded, but awake. The teacher's ears, that once caught whispers in crowded classrooms, had caught a secret much darker, and now I would remember every word. I would write it down. I would hold it like a weapon until the time came. I could feel the shape of it already, like a blade hidden in a book. They thought I was weak. They thought I was old. They thought I would die before the truth came out. But I was still here, breathing, and my son was not telling me to be quiet forever. He was telling me to wait. I have watched Layla's face in dreams since that night, but she did not come from nowhere. She was never meant to be a daughter-in-law. She was always a predator. Years ago, when Layla was a scholarship student at the small college where Walter volunteered, I saw her first as a bright girl with modest clothes, scholarship books, and a quiet smile. Walter had established a charity fund to help underprivileged students pay tuition, and Layla was one of its first recipients. He used to bring me letters of thanks she had written, how she would never forget his kindness. He said of her, softly, "She deserves a second chance." After I insisted he be cautious, he would say, "April, she has nowhere else but hope." That phrase haunted me later. When I confronted Dustin long ago, he defended Walter. "Dad sees something in her mama, something you refuse to see." I shrank into silence because I had been proud once, and sometimes love makes people mute. But the wound of that decision had lingered. 10 years ago, after I asked for separation because we could not reconcile differences, Walter never told you, Dustin, but I was crushed to see him gift Layla a framed photograph of the two of them at a campus event. I asked about it. He said, "She reminds me of what I lost." I warned him, "Do not invest hope in someone else until you've repaired what you have." He called me cold and controlling. I was chastised as too old, too strict, too suspicious, and they told neighbors I was merely jealous, bitter, unable to welcome a new family. The years passed. Layla vanished after graduation. We heard rumors of her going to graduate school, of her leaving the state, of her appearing in charity ads. Walter never spoke of her again, but his eyes often lingered on her awards and old letters in his study. When Dustin came home one evening, young and hopeful, he handed me a photograph. Layla, smiling by a campus fountain. He said, "Mom, I bumped into someone who reminds me of hope." I recognized that gleam in his eyes, the same glimmer Walter used to have when he looked at me before our love frayed. I asked nothing, but I felt a tremor in my bones. Then, Layla knocked on our front door, framed by the evening light, with a suitcase and that same soft voice. She introduced herself as Dustin's old college friend, someone he had mentioned in passing, someone she said had returned to reconnect. Dustin welcomed her in. "She moved into his old room while she looks for her own place," she said softly. "I cleared a place in the closet, made room in the pantry. But the way she leaned into Dustin when she hugged goodbye, the way Walter's eyes flickered when she spoke about sacrifices she made, all of it unsettled me. She was polite in public. In private, she tossed back her hair, glided into rooms uninvited, touched objects on the shelf she had no right to touch. She watched me read the paper, comment on the news, sit by the window. She said, "It is sweet mother and son time. I will take a walk." And she left the door open behind her. I once cautioned Dustin at dinner. Layla wasn't raised among us. She holds another set of values. He looked at me with wounded patience. "Mom, do not speak like that. She is the same as us now." Layla glided away with a polite, cold smile. Later that night, Dustin searched on his phone. I heard silence. I knew he was verifying. He cornered me later and said, "I found things about her. Bank accounts in other states, name variations, odd tax records. But I need you calm. We proceed quietly." Soon, Layla asked to begin full residency in our house. She said she would help with cooking, cleaning, family tasks. She wanted to forge bonds. But even that offer was wrapped in poison. I was asked to eat in the kitchen, subdued, while they dined in the living room. She told me, "Mom, you are a bit slow at hearing jokes now." Walter laughed along. I swallowed the insult. I had lived long enough to understand that people do cruelty slowly, in small increments. I was pushed aside at holiday dinners, moved to the edge of the table, sometimes given bread crusts, while Layla and Walter shared the best cuts. I became the background figure, the old ghost in my own home. Sometimes Layla would say, loud enough for neighbors to hear, "I do hope you get your rest, Mrs. Holloway," as though my tired limbs were a fault. When I looked at her, she'd flicker that poised smile. Dustin would not defend me. He would say, "She means well." And I would nod, lips pressed, furious inside. So when I saw them that night, her arms around him, her lips calling him Daddy, all the years of displacement, the small thefts of dignity, the quiet erasures, came flooding to the fore. I was not a woman set aside. I had watched my own house be rearranged around her. I had felt the air shift. But that word Daddy in that voice meant she believed she had already moved into his heart. And Dustin's whisper, "Do not stop them yet," told me he would use that moment as his weapon. They think she is wife material. She is nothing but a vulture perched in my home. But I will wait. I will watch. I will reclaim. I found the footage 2 days after the night she whispered, "Daddy," in my kitchen. Dustin knocked on my bedroom door just after breakfast, the way he used to when he was 12 and had broken something and needed me to tell him it would be okay. Only this time, his eyes were colder, sharper. He handed me a USB drive. "Do not watch it in the living room," he said. "Use the old laptop in your study. Alone." I waited until the sun had dropped behind the hills, when Walter and Layla left for a walk, another one of their fresh air rituals. I closed the door to my study, drew the curtain, and opened the laptop I had not used in months. It wheezed to life like an old man groaning awake. I plugged in the drive with shaking hands. The folder opened to 7 video files, each time-stamped, each labeled with nothing more than Cam A, Cam B, and so on. The first file showed the kitchen from the upper corner, where Dustin had installed a hidden camera inside an unused smoke detector. Layla was at the table, looking through a small stack of mail. She opened one envelope, took out a check Walter had received from his pension fund, and smiled. She didn't say a word, just ran her fingernail along the edge of the check and folded it back into the envelope. Then she took a small white envelope from her purse and slipped a folded $100 bill inside before placing it into Walter's coat pocket hanging on the chair. She adjusted her blouse in the reflection of the microwave door. Not once did she look worried. The next video showed the living room from a camera inside the mantel clock. Layla leaned against Walter, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on his thigh as he laughed, his hand resting limply on hers. She whispered, "You've been so good to me, Daddy," and my stomach clenched again at that word. He chuckled and said, "No one's ever taken care of me the way you do." Then she said, "That check you got today, maybe you should move it to an account just for us." She kissed his cheek. He didn't pull away. My hand trembled over the mouse. I clicked file after file. Layla deleting texts. Layla coaching Walter to say he wanted her on the house deed. Layla tearing up in front of Dustin, accusing me of jealousy and verbal abuse. She called me a tramp. Layla lied to him, her voice trembling. Dustin stood still, no emotion, no response. She didn't know she was being watched. She thought she was winning. The last video stopped. The screen went black. I stared at the reflection of my own face on the laptop screen, stunned. This was no flirtation. This was not midlife crisis. This was extraction. A performance, calculated affection, played out on the man I once gave the best years of my life to. She's pretending to be my future daughter-in-law, I whispered aloud, my voice barely there, so she can sleep with my husband in my own house. The betrayal tasted like rust. Dustin walked in without knocking. I hadn't heard him come upstairs. I looked at him, my eyes burning. She touched him with the same hands she used to shake mine at dinner, I said. He nodded. Now you understand why I didn't stop them. I expected tears. I expected him to rage. Instead, he pulled out a folder and placed it on my lap. Inside was a legal brief. His voice was steady. We let her finish what she started, he said. We get everything on paper. We let her marry him. She gets access to his money, legally. And then, we let her hang herself with her own rope. I blinked. You want them to get married? Mom, he said. She's after the money, not him. The moment she thinks she has it all, she'll disappear. And when she does, I'll have every document in hand to prove what she is. The fraud. The manipulation. Her criminal past. He leaned forward, his eyes fierce. But you can't break character. Not once. Not one single moment. You want me to pretend I don't know, I said. You want me to be the frail old woman who's just happy for her family. Yes. And then? Then we bury them with the truth. I sat back. My hands gripped the arms of the chair. My body felt 100 years old, but something inside me, something sharp and forgotten, woke up. I nodded slowly. I'll start writing everything down, I said. He smiled for the first time in weeks. Good. Be the grandmother they think is losing her mind. Take notes, mumble to yourself, but record every detail. That night, I began. I found an old notepad in the sewing cabinet. I titled the first page, For the Record. Every smile Layla faked, every lie Walter swallowed, every phrase that twisted my stomach, I wrote it down. I played deaf when Layla made phone calls in the hallway, pretending not to hear her say, "Once I get the house signed, we're out." I played slow when she whispered, "April should really think about assisted living." I nodded at her fake concern. I even thanked her for the cup of tea she laced with just enough wine to make me drowsy at dinner. I waited. If you're still listening to this story and your blood is boiling like mine was, if you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. Because what came next, too, was war in slow motion. She thought I was drifting. She thought I was fading. She thought she had clipped my wings. But I wasn't gone. I was gathering. I was watching. And I was writing every page of her downfall before she even realized there was a story being written. It happened quietly, like all betrayals in this house. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found my favorite tea canister missing. Layla smiled from the stove and said, "Oh, you don't need caffeine anymore, do you?" I read it's bad for older people's hearts. I bit my tongue, took a glass of water, and returned to my seat in the corner of the dining room, my designated place now. They had begun referring to it as April's little nook, like I was a piece of outdated furniture moved to the side of a modern home. But it wasn't until the day I heard her on the phone that I knew she was ready to erase me entirely. She didn't know I was in the hallway when she spoke to someone, her sister perhaps. Her voice was syrupy and low. "She's still here," Layla said, laughing softly. "But not for long. Walter's signing the papers today. I'll have full medical proxy by next week, and then we can move her out. I'm thinking Rosewood, quiet, clean, and far enough that Dustin won't visit." She called it proxy, but what she meant was power, control, possession of the old woman who saw too much. That afternoon, Walter sat in the study with Layla beside him, guiding his pen like a loving nurse. "It's just in case of emergency," she cooed, "so I can help make decisions if something ever happens to you or April." Walter, soft and compliant, nodded. His hand shook slightly, but the signature landed clean. Walter had grown frailer, and Layla played on his fears. What if April collapses? What if something happens to me and no one can act quickly? She said, tearfully. "This is just precaution for everyone's safety." She spoke with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed it. Layla clapped her hands gently and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've just made life so much easier." Dustin arrived minutes later. Layla greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a glowing smile. "It's done," she whispered, slipping the signed papers into a folder. "You're going to feel so much better once the house is less tense." Dustin didn't blink. "Good," he said, in that calm tone he'd been wearing like armor. "It's what's best for everyone." She smiled wider. "They thought I didn't know." I noticed that Dr. Carmichael, their longtime physician, looked skeptical when he glanced at the paperwork. Later, he called Dustin discreetly. "That signature. It didn't look like your father's. I've seen him sign for 20 years. That moment would become key." That evening, I sat in the corner during dinner. Layla served everyone lamb stew and poured a glass of red for Walter. When she brought my bowl, it was lukewarm. No wine, no bread. She placed it down like a dog's dish, then walked past me as though I were air. Later, when I tried to take a seat at the table for dessert, Layla stared me down. "Do you mind?" she snapped. "This is for family." I stared back. "And what exactly do you think I am?" She smirked. "Outdated. A placeholder. Honestly, April, it's time you admit this isn't your home anymore. You should be resting in a place with nurses and warm blankets. Not here, hovering over every meal like a ghost." My hands didn't tremble. Not this time. "Be careful," I said softly. "Ghosts tend to linger where wrong has been done." She rolled her eyes and turned away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room was cold, my bones ached. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the silence downstairs, wondering how many more times I would be made to feel invisible before I finally disappeared. And then I remembered Dustin's eyes. "Let her think she's winning," he had said. "The moment she believes she's safe is when she'll show her real face." He was right. The real face arrived the following night. I was reaching for a spoon from the drawer when Layla stormed into the kitchen. She had Walter's favorite cardigan in her arms, covered in red wine. She was furious, muttering curses under her breath. When she saw me, standing quietly by the sink, she paused. "What are you staring at?" she hissed. I didn't answer. She stepped closer. "I asked you a question." Still, I said nothing. "You think just because you birthed Dustin, you have some eternal claim on this house?" she snapped. "You're a relic, April. A prop. I'm the one Walter trusts now. I'm the one who's building a future with your family. You're just in the way." I turned to face her fully. "And what does that make you, Layla? The mother-in-law of your lover?" Her face went pale, then red, then hard. She stepped forward and slapped me across the cheek. Not a tap, not a brush. A full, open-handed slap that snapped my head sideways. The kitchen went silent. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I slowly turned back to her, pressing my palm to the warmth rising on my cheek. She stood over me, chest heaving. "Don't you ever speak to me like that again." I smiled, not kind, not warm, cold. I looked her right in the eyes and said, "You'll regret this. Not because I'll fight you, but because you don't know how many days I have left to observe." I turned my back and walked out of the room. In my bedroom, I sat down, opened my old flip phone, the one no one knew I kept in the sewing basket, and typed out a single message to Dustin. She struck me. No response. Just the 3 dots, blinking. Then he replied, "Thank you. We're ready now." I placed the phone on the nightstand. I lay down with the sting still blooming on my cheek and the taste of copper behind my teeth. Let her think she had won. Because when the time came, I would make sure she remembered that slap. I would make sure she remembered who she struck, not a frail old woman, but the only person in this house who still knew the truth. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring when Walter made his grand announcement. He gathered us in the living room, me, Dustin, and Layla, and stood tall with a paper in his hand and his chest puffed out like a peacock, preparing to impress a flock. His hand trembled slightly as he held up the announcement. "I've decided," he said, voice cracking with what he clearly believed was noble emotion, "to marry Layla, this Saturday, in our garden. Just a small celebration of love. I want to be happy again, before my time runs out." Layla clutched his arm like a lifeline. Her eyes shimmered with fake surprise. "Walter, are you sure?" she asked, already smiling. "You're going to make me cry." He beamed at her like a man 10 years younger. I sat in my usual corner chair, legs crossed, hands folded, watching with the stillness of someone observing the final turn of a loaded gun. Dustin didn't flinch. He nodded, slow and controlled. "That's wonderful, Dad," he said. "You deserve happiness." Then he glanced sideways at me, and in that glance I saw everything we'd prepared begin to bloom. I didn't speak. I simply stood and walked to my room. If Layla noticed the lack of protest, she assumed it was defeat, but I was already choosing the purple dress. The one I had saved for my granddaughter's graduation, which never happened. I ironed it that night with the care of a woman preparing to bury someone. The day of the wedding was absurdly perfect sunlight on polished leaves, the faint smell of tulips, and trimmed hedges. Walter had invited a handful of old colleagues, a neighbor or two, and one elderly pastor who had officiated his brother's funeral. There were champagne flutes set up on silver trays. Layla wore white, of course, simple, silk, her hair in soft waves, her lips crimson. I arrived with Dustin on my arm, like a relic brought out for sentiment. I wore the purple dress, a pair of old pearl earrings, and silence. Absolute, dignified silence. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle around the small gazebo Walter had always meant to repaint. Someone had tied fake ivy around the rails. A Bluetooth speaker played string quartet covers of pop songs Layla probably chose herself. She looked radiant in the way that poison can look clear in a glass. When the pastor called for the ceremony to begin, Walter smiled like a boy in love. Layla clutched his hand and squeezed. He winced slightly. She was always rougher than she meant to be. The vows were short, sweet, in the synthetic way that syrup is sweet. Walter promised to protect, to honor. Layla promised to care, to nurture. The audience cooed at her tears. She wiped them with the back of her gloved hand, as though she didn't want to ruin the show. Then came the question. "If there is anyone present who objects to this union," the pastor said, "speak now, or forever hold your peace." The air stilled. My heart thudded once, hard, in my chest. And then Dustin stepped forward. Everyone turned. I looked up, startled but only for effect. He cleared his throat. "No," he said, slowly, calmly. "I won't object." Layla smiled, triumphant, bold. Dustin continued. "In fact, I think they should belong completely to each other. Forever, in every legal and spiritual sense." His voice didn't crack. His eyes were flint. Walter looked confused. Layla beamed. "I think," Dustin added, "they deserve each other so fully that there's nothing left between them and the rest of us." He stepped back. "I wish them joy." The pastor nodded, slightly unsettled. The ceremony finished in less than 10 minutes. Walter signed the marriage certificate with shaking hands. Layla kissed his cheek, and he whispered something in her ear. She nodded, already dreaming of account balances and property deeds. They toasted with cheap champagne. I sipped water. The party ended just before dusk. Layla took Walter's hand and led him back inside the house, like a nurse returning a patient to his room. Dustin and I stayed outside for a moment, under the hanging lights. I could smell the burnt ends of old roses, the residue of perfume, the scent of victory. 48 hours, he said. I nodded. She'll file it immediately. Everything gets transferred, Dustin added. Joint accounts, property, retirement funds. And then, I whispered. We watch. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That night, I returned to my room and opened the notebook I'd been keeping. I added a new date, the day she became legally responsible, the day she inherited a man she never loved. Let her think she'd won. Let her sleep beside him and dream of vacation homes and silk robes. Because what she didn't know was that 48 hours after a marriage certificate was processed, financial records became fully traceable. Fraud became provable. Property transfers became permanent. She had just walked into a legal web. Every lie she told about who she was, about her name, her past, was now attached to a lawful, documented relationship. She didn't marry a man. She married evidence. And my son gave her the rope with a smile. The house was silent when I woke the next morning. Too silent. The kind of silence that comes after the last shot's been fired and the smoke hasn't cleared. Walter wasn't in his bed. The front door was ajar. I found him in the kitchen, pacing barefoot in the same suit trousers from the night before, shirt unbuttoned at the neck, hair wild. His face was pale, like someone had reached in and stolen the blood from his veins. "She's gone," he said, before I could ask. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the clock. 6:42 a.m. He held out his phone. She left me a voice memo. Just this. He pressed play. Layla's voice came through, cool and syrupy. "Walter, I'm so sorry, baby. I had to go. Something came up. You wouldn't understand. Don't look for me, okay? It's better this way. You were good to me. Take care." And then it clicked off. No apology, no explanation, no goodbye, just a practiced escape. He tried calling her 5 times while I made coffee, straight to voicemail. When he logged into his bank account, his fingers trembled. The screen loaded, then froze. "Your access has been temporarily restricted. Please contact your bank." I sipped my coffee and waited. He called the bank. They told him his joint account had been drained. The private retirement account he'd opened years ago, under just his name, was empty too. Layla had already transferred the bulk of Walter's savings to an offshore account under a shell company she controlled. The account was drained before the freeze order was issued. "She must have accessed my information somehow," he mumbled, "but I never gave her the login." He didn't need to. She had lived in our house for nearly a year. She knew his passwords, his patterns, his schedule. "She took everything," he whispered, sitting down hard at the table. "April, I don't even have enough in the checking account to cover the mortgage." "Shouldn't be a problem," I said gently, "since the house is no longer yours." He looked at me like I'd slapped him. Within hours, the truth unraveled like a bloodied ribbon. A call from Sacramento PD came first. Then, the FBI. They had flagged Layla's marriage certificate. One of the agents recognized her alias. Her face, her patterns, her signature on the financial forms all matched a woman wanted in 2 other states for marriage fraud, financial theft, and identity falsification. She had used 3 different names in 3 different states. Each time, she'd married an older man, waited 6 to 8 months, then vanished with every dollar and document. This time, thanks to the footage Dustin had compiled, there was more than enough to pursue her internationally. But she was gone. Dustin arrived just after noon. He didn't greet Walter. He walked straight to me, kissed my cheek, and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a printed invitation, ivory with gold trim. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Dustin Holloway and Emily Chen, Saturday, Sonoma Garden Chapel, 3 p.m. Walter read over my shoulder. He didn't speak until the silence burned. "You're getting married?" His voice cracked like an old record. "You never told me." Dustin didn't look at him. "Didn't think you'd be available." Walter's lips parted. "Can I come?" he asked, like a child begging for dessert. Dustin stared at him, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he looked to me. "Mom," he said, soft and firm, "you'll be standing with us. With me and Emily. You deserve that spot." I nodded. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. Walter dropped to his knees on the kitchen floor. "April," he said, hoarse. "I was stupid. I know I was stupid. She tricked me. I was lonely. You and we had problems, yes, but I never meant to hurt you like this. Please, just let me come to my son's wedding. Just to watch, please. I looked down at him. The man I once loved. The man who had let a stranger humiliate me in my own home. The man who had ignored every warning, silenced every protest, signed every paper. You chose to be deceived, I said, my voice low. I chose to stand. And I walked out of the room. He didn't follow. He couldn't. At the wedding, the sun lit the vineyard with golden light. Emily was radiant in lace and grace. Dustin waited at the altar with calm joy. As the music swelled, I took his arm. We walked slowly, side by side, toward a new chapter. When we reached the front, Dustin turned and looked into my eyes. "This day is yours too, Mom," he said. "You saved me." And behind us, far beyond the rows of white chairs, behind the fence where no one stood, was the outline of a man in a wrinkled shirt, watching from a distance. I never turned back to look. I didn't need to. It was a small chapel tucked between rolling hills and rows of sunlit vines, the kind of place where you could hear your own breath and the rustle of satin against wood pews. Simple, sacred, and nothing like the spectacle Layla had dreamed for herself. This was quiet joy, not curated illusion. Dustin adjusted his cufflinks beside me as guests filled the pews. He wore navy blue, a nod to his grandfather, and a lavender boutonniere Emily had chosen to match my dress. I wore deep plum again, only this time not as armor, but as honor. It shimmered under the stained glass windows like the last bloom of autumn. No cameras, no press, just family, friends, and a pianist softly playing Moon River. The officiant stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice bright, "please rise as we welcome the bride and the representative of the groom's family." I felt the blood leave my hands. Dustin turned to me and smiled. "And now," the officiant continued, "we invite Miss April Holloway, mother of the groom, to join him at the altar." My knees didn't buckle, but they might have if Dustin hadn't taken my hand. As I walked that aisle beside him, a wave of clapping rose behind us. Not polite clapping, real, grateful, soul-deep clapping. Like every woman in that room saw something of herself in me. In the silence I had kept, in the storm I had weathered. At the altar, Emily waited with tears in her eyes. She nodded at me, lips trembling. Her hand reached out and gently brushed mine before she took Dustin's. The ceremony was beautiful in its sincerity. No grandeur, just vows that were meant and promises that weren't rehearsed. And then came the toasts. Dustin stood. His voice didn't shake. "I could stand here and tell you about how much I love Emily," he said, "but everyone can see that." Soft laughter, soft smiles. "But I also need to tell you something else. I almost lost myself this year. I almost let something evil into my family, into my mother's house, into her name." The room went silent. There was one person who saw it for what it was. And she didn't shout. She didn't storm out. She stayed. She watched. She protected me when I didn't deserve it. And when I finally saw what she saw, she stood beside me anyway. He turned to me. "No one has ever protected me like my mother. And no one has ever understood me the way she did, even in silence." I didn't cry often. I'd been taught not to. But in that moment, as the entire room stood again and applauded me not for being perfect, but for surviving, I let the tears fall. Far away, in a small apartment filled with empty drawers and silence, Walter watched the live stream on a borrowed tablet. I didn't know he was watching until days later. I didn't ask, but I felt it. Because when Dustin leaned in to whisper, "This day is yours too," I knew that the man I once called my husband was out there, hearing it all. And for the first time, I felt no bitterness, just clarity. He made his choices. And so did I. The roses came back, that spring blooms thick and wild, curling like velvet fists around the garden gate I'd nearly torn down in a fit of grief 5 years earlier. But I didn't tear it down. I stayed. And now they grew without asking for permission, like something in me that refused to die. The house was quiet again. My quiet. No footsteps in the night, no echo of whispered betrayal in the hallway. Just the purr of marmalade, the orange tabby who took up residence on the porch swing, and the rustle of wind against the hydrangeas that Dustin replanted for me last fall. He came every Sunday, never empty-handed, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with Emily, who always hugged me like I mattered. "Do you want to come live with us, Mom?" Dustin had asked once, gently. I smiled. "No, sweetheart. This house may have hurt me, but it's still mine. I don't abandon my roots just because the storm passed. I tended to the garden," I wrote, "and I waited not for vengeance, not anymore, but for closure." It came from a push notification on Dustin's phone one Tuesday morning. He called me immediately. "They got her," he said. "Where?" "Istanbul Airport. Interpol had flagged her passport 3 weeks ago. She was trying to board a flight to Greece under the name Sophia Brooks. Layla, or whatever she called herself that week." He sent me the link. Headlines flashed across major outlets. "Wedding con woman caught in Turkey ties to multi-state fraud network." "Michigan man's widow brings down international marriage scam." "Justice for April Holloway." I didn't feel joy, not exactly. What I felt was the tightening of a stitch that had been loose for too long, like the hem of my life had finally been mended. Walter didn't call, but I knew what happened next. His bank accounts were unrecoverable. Layla had cleaned him out with surgical precision. The house she forced him to co-sign to her name was seized in a federal investigation. He had to move into a state-run facility on the edge of town, the kind with flickering lights and cracked linoleum floors. No visitors, no pictures on the walls. I heard from a nurse, an old student of mine, actually, that he spent most days sitting by the window, watching birds he couldn't name, whispering the same phrase over and over. She said she loved me. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not really. Some men die slow, not from disease, but from the emptiness they once mistook for love. That summer, I finished my book. I titled it, "The Bride Who Never Meant to Marry." It wasn't angry. It wasn't even bitter. It was quiet, precise. The truth laid bare in the soft, unblinking way the truth often is. Every chapter was a confession I hadn't dared make out loud. Every word a memory I had once buried to keep the peace. When it hit the shelves, I thought it would sell 12 copies, maybe 24. It sold out in 3 days. Book clubs called, podcasts, late-night shows. One woman sent me a letter that said, "You reminded me that quiet women aren't weak. We're just waiting to strike where it counts." I pinned it to my fridge with a magnet that used to hold Dustin's finger paintings. And still, every Sunday, Dustin came. One afternoon, while planting new lavender, he said, "I think you outlasted them all, Mom." I chuckled. I didn't mean to. He looked at me. "But you did." I wiped my hands on my apron and looked at the garden around me, the wild, gorgeous disorder of it. The way it bloomed not because it was told to, but because it could. I didn't win in a courtroom. I didn't shout in a hallway. I didn't throw punches or press charges. I just lived. Longer than the lies. Louder than the silence. And now, as the wind shifts the light through the trees, I sit here, my back straight, my hands strong, my name unforgotten. They tried to erase me, but I kept growing. And when you bloom where you were once buried, the world remembers. Thank you for listening to my story. If this tale moved something in you, if you've ever been dismissed, silenced, or underestimated, remember this. You do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to fight loud to win. You only need to know who you are and outlast the storm. If you believe stories like these deserve to live on true stories, from the quietest women in the room, please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Every listen, every share, helps our voices echo where they were once ignored. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget, revenge has no expiration date. And when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.